Hello, everyone. This is the 159th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview English author Mr. Rob Sawyer as we discuss his book, Broken Dreams, Everton, the War, and Goodison's Lost Generation. This book chronicles the Everton squad that won the 1938-39 league title and its trajectory following the outbreak of the Second World War. Mr. Sawyer is a founding member of Toffeeopolis, which is a collection of Everton-related authors and part of the Mount Vernon Group. Mr. Sawyer is the author of the following books as well: Harry Catterick, The Untold Story of a Football Great; Blue Dragon, the biography of Roy Vernon; The Prince of Centre-Halves, the life of Tommy T.G. Jones; Jack Coulter, From Whiteabbey to Goodison Park; The Keith Newton Story; and the Hope Robertson Chronicles. Welcome, Rob.
Welcome. Thanks to be on with you.
Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
Yeah, I'm a sort of lifetime Everton supporter. Clearly, always had a general interest in history. I used to be given sort of Everton history books by my parents when I was young. Obviously, I have some family history with the club, with my great grandfather serving on the board of directors in the 1920s. So that's always added to my interest in the sort of 1920s, 1930s of the club. And about 15 years ago, I just started writing a few articles for a website called Toffeeweb. And one thing led to another. And about 11 years ago, I decided to try and write a book about Harry Catterick, one of the great figures in the club's history. And fortunately, a publisher called De Coubertin took that on and got that book out about 10 years ago. And then just once you do it once, you sort of get the bug. And since then, I've been continuing to write books when I have time, and also continue to just research the history of the club and write articles for Toffee Web, and also the Everton FC Heritage Society that I'm a member of. That's a voluntary group of like-minded Evertonians who love to research and chronicle the club's history and tell it either through articles, books, or through exhibitions, or even now we're making some films that go on our YouTube channel. So just a love for the club, but also a love for sort of digging into its history and making sure it's shared for the next generation.
You've already written a number of Everton football history related books. What was the trigger to write about this particular topic?
I'd already touched on the 1930s in my book about Harry Catterick when he was a player. Also, the book about T.G. Jones, who again was breaking through in the late 30s. So I'd sort of touched on that subject and wanted to go deeper because it was such a fascinating decade for the club, a decade where the club had been relegated to the lower division and come straight back up, won the league again in 1932, won the FA Cup, and then had a sort of some years where they were just not where they were underperforming, and then suddenly, right at the end of the decade, they go and win the league title again with one of their best ever teams. And then the whole backdrop to that of what was going on in Europe in the late 1930s, and then the way the team's potential was sort of stopped in its tracks by the outbreak of the Second World War. So there's just so much going in there. There was a story to be told, and also it was my dad's favourite team. If you asked him, he'd seen teams going all the way back to the early 1930s until he died in 2012, and he said some of those players were the best to play for the club. So it was almost to go back and almost in honor of my dad, really go back and learn more about that team and make sure that they were given the prominence that maybe they don't receive, because of course they played in an era before television where there's only tiny snippets of film footage. So I wanted to try and bring them to life on the pages of a book.
As you mentioned, this book discusses events that are nearly a century old.
Mm.
So, what was your research process for such a task and the duration to write this book?
Oh, I started the book about 7 years ago, so it's been a very gradual process. Just starting to research all the players who were and club officials who were involved there at the time, and that involved trying to contact families because clearly the last of the players involved died in the early 2000s. So there was no first-hand player recollection. So it was going to the families, seeing what memories they had, what documentation. photographs, etc., to try and get the sort of the picture, the mental picture of the person as much as the footballer. There are still, thankfully, one or two Everton supporters still alive who watch that team, or maybe watch the players who've been in that team. You know, they watched them maybe after the war. So trying to get some first-hand recollections of seeing the players. And then, of course, it's going into archives, and it's a lot easier now than it would have been 20 years ago, because obviously there's one or two online newspaper archives that you can have access to just go through the match reports. And also a fellow Evertonian called Billy Smith has a wonderful website called bluecorrespondent.co.uk. And Billy, over the past 15, 20 years, has been going back, looking at old newspapers on microfilm in libraries, and then transcribing that onto his website. So, you know, it's just this huge body of work. So you can go back and see what was happening day by day as reported by the Liverpool, the Merseyside newspapers throughout that era. So it's been a combination of speaking to people, getting hold of documents that are out there, but also getting access to newspaper reports. And then obviously researching the wider context of politics that was going on in both Britain and Europe at the time to give that wider context.
Let's go back in time. Can you present the status of Everton in the English football landscape in the 1930s?
Yeah, I mean, Everton were probably by this point already one of the what we would call the football aristocrats in England. The club dates back to 1878 when it was formed as a church or a chapel football team in the sort of north of Liverpool. They'd quickly become one of the prominent teams in the land, and were one of the first members of the Football League when that was formed in the late 1880s. So by the time we're getting to the 1930s, the club had already won the FA Cup in 1906. They'd won the league in the 1890s, and then again in 1928 when Dixie Dean scored his record 60 league goals. And then in the 1930s, they started badly with relegation, but then had won the league and the FA Cup in the early 1930s. So they're one of the big teams. Liverpool, obviously a soccer-mad city. Goodison Park, by this point, was one of the great stadiums in the land with big attendances and a fervent support. So one of the big clubs, really, one of the well-connected. The club's chairman was involved in the sort of administration of the game in England. So yeah, very much an aristocrat. Not the most successful team in the 30s. Probably Arsenal at this point, if you look at the 30s as a whole, they're probably the top team, the most consistent team. But Everton was sort of certainly one of the leading clubs in the land.
What can I say of the then Everton manager Theo Kelly?
To call Kelly a manager is probably a stretch. This is the thing. Everton were becoming a little bit behind the times. A number of clubs, including Arsenal, had appointed a manager in the sense that we would understand a manager now, somebody in charge of the team affairs, who would pick the team, who would oversee the training of the team. That wasn't the case at Everton. Kelly was really an administrator. He was the secretary, and by that, club secretary, that's the person who effectively runs the business, runs the business on a day-to-day basis. So Kelly wasn't really a football man. He hadn't played football to any level. He'd coached, I think, maybe the third or fourth team at the club. But he was the man who just kept things ticking over. Very clever guy, great at publicity. He also sort of edited the club program every week. But he wasn't the guy picking the team. That was, you had the trainer, a guy called Harry Cook, who would keep the club players fit, do exercises. And then you'd have some of the directors would actually choose the team. Clearly, they'd listen to Theo Kelly, they'd listen to Harry Cook, the trainer, and they might also listen to the club captain at the time. But it was more of a collective thing. There wasn't one person who was the team manager. So Kelly, lots of talent. He kept the team together. He was great for team spirit. They would go and stay away in sort of training camps for a couple of days. And he was great at sort of getting the players all interacting and building that team spirit. But he wasn't a manager or a coach like you'd see today.
You already touched up on it. Naturally, the events of the book on the field are juxtaposed with the geopolitical events off of it.
Mm-hmm.
Can you paint a picture of this reality at that time where war seemed to be on the horizon?
Certainly, there were tensions in Europe by the 1930s. But if you'd ask people at the start of the 1938-39 season, is there going to be war? I think most people would have hoped not. clearly the Nazis had come to power in the early 30s. That hadn't stopped Everton going to play in Germany a couple of times in the 1930s on their summer tours in 1932. And then in 1936, they went again, and they even played in the brand new Olympic Stadium. So Everton had quite close ties with the head of the German Football Federation, a guy called Otto Nerz. By 1938, yes, it was clear that Germany had expansionist intentions and was already doing so. So, yes, there was tension. Obviously, there'd been negotiations with Neville Chamberlain flying over to Germany to try and get an accord. But yes, it was a backdrop. But even with that in mind, Everton was still intending to go to Germany again in the summer of 1939 for another summer tour. And that was still being talked about as we entered 1939. So, yes, there was tensions on the horizon. People were being trained up as sort of to do air raid response in the case there was a war. There was a juxtaposition. There was preparations underway. Britain had started to increase its manufacture of arms, of aircraft, etc. But on the other hand, until probably February 1939, Everton still thought they were going to go and play a series of friendlies in Germany in the summer of 1939. So the absolute reality probably only dawned as we got into sort of March or so, when it became clear that there was a very high chance of war and that the possibility of actually traveling to Germany was unwise, to put it mildly.
The structure of your book is divided in three parts: the league race, the warriors, and the aftermath. Can you discuss this format you chose?
Yeah, originally the format was fairly simple. It was going to be almost a telling of the season chronologically, and then a look at the players, each of the players and the squad members and the officials sort of individually in the second chapter. At the suggestion of my friend and colleague James Corbett, we revisited that, and what we decided to do was, in the first part, tell the story of the season, but also use it as a way to introduce the players and the officials. So what I did was, you'd be talking about certain games through the season, and if a certain player featured heavily in that game, I'd use it as the opportunity to introduce that player to the reader, tell you a little bit about his background and his story, and then what he brought to the team. So the largest part of the book is the first chapter, because it's telling or the first section, it's telling the story of the season, but it's also introducing you, the reader, to all these people, all these players, so that you sort of understand who the characters were. Once we get on to the second section, which is about the Second World War, that's just explaining how Everton and Goodison Park continued to operate through that period, and football more generally, how it was affected in England, and also give some context about what the players were then doing during the war, because they either enlisted in the military or they were engaged in duties at home in England, in the UK, in the war efforts, so working in factories, etc. And then the last section was really the aftermath. So it was saying, okay, we had league champions in 1939, we've had 7 years without proper regular football. Where did Everton pick up after that? And also what became of all these people as players or in their later lives. So that's how I structured it.
And incidentally, this league title was achieved just after Everton had lost its greatest star, Dixie Dean. Was this success a surprise at the time, given that?
It was certainly a surprise, not so much because Dean was sort of on his way out of the club. It was a surprise because we'd been so poor the season before. So in the 1937-38 season, Everton at one point looked like they were going to be relegated. And it was only by recalling maybe 3 players into the team later on that it steadied results, and we were safe by the end of the season. Dixie Dean is one of the greats of British football, arguably one of the greats of world football, but it's hard to judge in that old era. An amazing goal scorer, as I touched on earlier. In 1928, he scored a record 60 league goals in a season to propel the Toffees to the league title. No player in England in the top flight has scored 60 league goals since. A couple of years ago, Erling Haaland looked like he might reach that mark, but failed to do it. So Dean was a legend, living legend. Probably by the mid-1930s, he wasn't the same player. He was troubled by lots of injuries because he'd been kicked brutally for so many years. So he lost his place in the team in the 37-38 season. And by the spring of 1938, he'd been transferred with very little fanfare to Notts County and played very few games for them. So really, Dean was coming to the end of his career. The surprise was more how we turned things around after a very poor season and sort of suddenly got on track in the autumn of 1938. And a big factor in that was Dean's replacement, who you probably want to talk about.
The names of Tommy Lawton and Joe Mercer are familiar to most football historians. Can you discuss the backbone of this Everton squad as we come to the summer of 1938?
Everton, if you look at the sort of spine, if you will, we had Ted Sagar, who was been at the club since 1929, so a very highly regarded goalkeeper. Not a huge man, but very agile, and he was one of these goalkeepers who commanded his area. So the defenders, his teammates in the penalty box, did what they were told, or they'd get a tongue lashing from him. In defence, you had two very solid fullbacks because you just have the two fullbacks back then in Billy Cook, an Irish international, and Norman Greenhalgh. The left backs were two very sort of tough tackling fullbacks who, of course, in that day, your fullbacks weren't like they are now. They're not people flying down the wing and supporting attacks. They were the two guys who were there to stop the wingers and stop the attackers. But then you had at centre-half, so somewhere between what you now have as a centre-back and a deep midfielder, you had a guy called Tommy G. Jones, T.G. Jones for short, who was this amazingly talented, tall player with such confidence and poise, dominance in the air, but also great on the ground. He would dribble out of his own penalty box. He had a thunderous shot when he did stride forward. Just a very cultured and talented centre-half. He became known as the Prince of Centre-Halves. That was to reflect how highly he was regarded by supporters. And then if you go further down the spine of the team, you've got Tommy Lawton at centre forward, who was still, when the season started, a teenager, but was already a man, really, and an amazing player. And if you were ever going to replace Dixie Dean, then Tommy Lawton was the man to do that because he was a prodigiously talented young man.
Can you describe the transfer activity of Everton going into the season?
One word, quiet. During the previous season, halfway through, they brought in two players. They brought in an England international winger called Wally Boys, and they brought in Norman Greenhalgh, the defender that I talked about. So they came in midway through the previous season. But in the summer of 1938, they brought in, I think, two squad players, so not players who they would thought would be playing first team football. One of them was a guy called George Milligan, who played one game in the 38-39 season. So, in a word, quiet. There's no four players going out, four players coming in, three players on loan. None of that. It was a very, very steady. They'd obviously decided that the players that had helped turn things around at the back end of the previous season were the right fit to take the club forward. And obviously they were proved right. But yes, compared to today's football where you've got all the talk, the speculation and the actual transfers going through, it was a very different picture back in the late 1930s.
What was the importance of the new Everton captain, the Scottish Jock Thompson?
Thompson, he'd been made captain, but he'd been at the club since 1930, so a hugely experienced player. He was a wing half, what you call them, what you now call a sort of a midfielder, for want of a better word. So 6 foot tall, strapping Scot. Been there, seen it, done it, tough but fair, and a leader of men on and off the pitch. He'd been out of the team for a couple of years, playing in the reserve team. Looked like his career was coming to an end. But as I said earlier, the team had struggled the previous season, so they brought Thompson. They also brought in Joe Mercer and Billy Cook back into the team, and they'd stabilised things. So Thompson had so impressed the Everton directors that they made him captain for the 38-39 season. So hugely important, just as somebody who got the experience, got the know-how, and always had the back of his players. One of his teammates told a story of on his debut for Everton, he was badly fouled by an opposition player. So Jock Thompson strode over him to and said, "Who did that to you?" His teammate said, "I think it was him." And sort of 5 minutes later, that opposition player is sort of sent flying over the touchline into the crowd with the hardest tattle that his teammate had ever seen. So knowing that you got somebody like Thompson in the team with you must have given you great confidence and reassurance. So his know-how was hugely important. Even later in the season when he was injured and then couldn't get back in the team, he was on the touchline actually coaching the side. So he was captain very much on and off the pitch.
In your book, you mentioned that the Empire Exhibition Tournament in the summer of 1938 as the reference point for this successful season. Can you explain the significance of it?
Well, for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, Everton had been underperforming as a team. It was still an expensively assembled squad. It wasn't like the Everton of today where we were sort of struggling to get players of quality. We had quality players, they just weren't performing well as a team. They'd had that rocky season before in 37-38, But then straight after the season, they were taking part in this invitational event up in Scotland, the Empire Exhibition Games. So it meant that basically they were living in a hotel together for several weeks. Lots of downtime to go and play golf, go and watch shows, or just spend time together. So it just bonded them. Several of the players, when interviewed in later years, said that was the making of the team as a unit. It just gelled them together, spending time together, and also on the pitch in this tournament, they reached the finals. So suddenly they just started to click. Obviously, one or two of these younger players were just starting to reach that point where they were going to fulfill their talents as well. It just meant that they went into the next season already full of confidence and having sort of reached an understanding with each other about how to play, so that when they started the season in the autumn of 1938, I think they won 6 games on the trot. And as I say, the importance of that time together in Scotland can't be underestimated.
Let's discuss this title winning season, 1938-39. The takeaway at the time.
I think people were hugely impressed by the side, just the way they started the season, 6 runs on the trot. Their home form was amazing, maybe just lost the once. They played brilliant football in a word, and it's by going back to source, going back to actually reading those reports, trying to actually get a flavour of how the spectators and the journalists saw them at the time, gives you that picture. This wasn't a team where they would just kick the ball forward and wait for Tommy Lawton to head the ball into the goal. They were playing some amazing joined up football. So you had T.G. Jones, this talented guy at the back who would stride forward with the ball. You had this amazing front line of 5 players. So Lawton was a 6-foot guy, big, strong, but mobile centre forward. But then you had these 4 little guys playing alongside him. You had Wally Boys and Alex Stevenson, 2 tiny guys on the left side of attack who would interplay and tease opposition defenders. You'd have Torry Gillick, who was this amazingly talented Scottish right winger, very mercurial. He could sort of switch off for 10 minutes and then suddenly he would zone back in and just destroy the opposition fullback. And then there was a guy called Stan Bentham, who was just like the engine room, who would just do the running for everybody else. But they just blended together. So Lawton wouldn't stay in the middle all the time. He would drift out to the right. Torry Gillick would drift in. So it was this sort of total football where the defenders were just bamboozled. They didn't know who was going to be where. So extremely great to watch. Short passing combined with long passing, great attacking play. A joy to watch. Where the team came unstuck sometimes was as we got into the winter. Some of the pitches that teams played on were frankly awful, especially away from home. So if you look at Everton's record, their record at away grounds. They lost quite a lot of games, but it's because they didn't want to compromise. They were trying to play proper football, playing the ball on the ground, lovely short passing, and the ball would just literally get stuck in the mud. So they were always sticking to their principles, and it cost them in some games. But fortunately, the record at Goodison Park meant that they were getting the points required to close in on the title in 1939.
You take time to highlight the importance of the physical trainer, Harry Cook. What was his exact role in the team?
So Cook was the man charged with keeping the team fit. As I said before, he wasn't so much about doing the tactics because that was set by almost by the directors. But what he did do, he had that close relationship, spending time with the guys every day. Cook had been at the club since he'd been a player in the very early 1900s. So huge lengths of service with the club, highly respected by the players. So he was the man taking training, but also the man giving them treatment. So if you picked up a knee strain and an ankle problem, you'd be in the treatment room with him later on, getting massaged, etc., and treated. So hugely important figure at the club. What he did introduce was a lot of training regimes that involved short passing. So the players would go on like a hard court to train on. They'd wear what you now call sneakers or trainers, but basically were just like gym pumps back then. And they'd be doing these sort of 1-touch, 2-touch passing games, which back then was quite an innovation. And that was just to develop this short, sharp passing technique that the team then took out onto the pitch. So Cook was a hugely important figure. And he was still at the club until 1961. So he had nearly 6 decades of service in the end to the club. So one of the great figures at Goodison Park.
We come to the September of 1939 and the outbreak of the war. Can you describe the changes at the club at the onset of the war and how generally the players' activities were during the war effort?
So obviously Everton finished champions in May of 1939. So huge optimism that this was a team that They won the title, and these players were going to come back later in the summer with an expectation that they could go on and do it again. The season actually started. They played 3 games. I think Everton had 1 win and 2 draws, so a moderate start to the season. But even at those games, the crowds were down. The enthusiasm wasn't there because people knew that it looked like war was highly likely. And sure enough, with the German invasion of Poland and the declaration of war, they came into Goodison Park the next day thinking, what the heck is going to happen to us? We're 1 minute we're on top of the world, next minute we don't know, are our careers finished? What's going to happen to us? So hugely concerning to the players as to what their futures were going to be. Basically, football was suspended pretty much immediately after the suspension, after the declaration of war. It was then allowed to continue again a few weeks later, but not in the usual league and cup structure. These were sort of they created regional sort of wartime leagues. So Everton would be playing teams that they never normally would have played, like Chester, sort of teams from that area, but not in the same division. So, and that was 7 years that we had football without the proper structures. As for the players themselves, a lot of them enlisted with the military, either the Air Force, Army, or the Navy. Mainly the Air Force and the Army. Probably deliberately, the powers that be didn't really want players on the front line in combat because it wouldn't have been a good look for Tommy Lawton or Joe Mercer or somebody to be killed in action. It would be not good for morale. So what the armed forces did was they took a lot of players on as what they call physical training instructors, whose job was to get new recruits fit. So they would be generally stationed in Great Britain, and they would just be training up new inductees, getting them fit to then go off and do active service. So those players had it relatively easy compared to a lot of the people in the armed forces, and there was some resentment that these footballers were getting away with it by just staying at home and doing it. But I don't think the government wanted them to be going off to actually fight in theatres of war.
And that was a stark contrast. There are many players who actually were killed during the First War.
Absolutely, yeah. It was strongly encouraged. Almost whole teams signed up in the First World War to join these battalions. I'm not saying that no footballers fought in theatres of war. There were some, but I would say probably 90% of footballers who did join the armed forces were employed in this sort of behind the front lines, physical training instructor kind of roles or technical roles, engineering, that kind of thing. They also played representative games for the army, for the Air Force, etc., that were played around the country to entertain both service personnel, but also entertain the general public. So they would be, your Joe Mercers, your Lawtons, your T.G. Jones, etc., would be playing games, not just for their clubs, but also for either their armed forces or in wartime internationals for their countries as well. The other Everton players who didn't join the forces were players who normally had a particular skill, so that maybe they'd done an apprenticeship in an engineering area before they became footballers, and they would be employed in the shipyards or maybe working in factories at air bases and would be doing that sort of what we call war work. And players would play if and when they could, so that there was very little opportunity to do training in the week. They would just tell the club if they were available on Saturday to turn up and play for the team. So it was a very different kind of football. And what you'd find is not so much Everton, but a lot of other clubs, they would just be short of players. So if you were based down in the south of England for a few months, you wouldn't turn out for Everton, you'd turn out for Aldershot or a club in the area that you happened to be staying in. So you had this thing where you didn't know from one week to the other who would be representing your club half the time. It was a very strange and very different kind of football, but it was necessary to help keep the country going and boost morale. In terms of Everton itself, the club, Theo Kelly was hugely important in just trying to keep the club going. In terms of, one, there was a lot less income, but two, just trying to organise who was going to play for the team every week. And then even stuff like looking out for damaged, bombs, because Liverpool was a very heavily bombed city because it was a port city on the Atlantic link to North America. So obviously the Luftwaffe were very interested in trying to destroy the docks, etc. So they had a watch, an air raid watch, to be looking out for sort of bomb damage or possible bomb damage to Goodison Park. Goodison was damaged on one evening by some nearby bombs. They damaged a couple of the stands, but that didn't stop Everton playing a game a couple of days later. It was just one of those things, just got on with it, and football carried on uninterrupted at Goodison Park. So Everton got through it. Theo Kelly, who sometimes gets criticised for some other aspects of his relationships with some players later on, but he was hugely important to keeping the club running throughout the Second World War.
Given the duration of the war, it seemed like many players would have been finished as active players at the end of this war due to either age or injury or other factors. Were there many of such cases?
Yeah, absolutely. You think you've lost 7 years of your career. So this team going into the war, I think the average age was about 24. So your players like Mercer, Lawton, TG Jones, these were players just coming into, and Alex Stevenson, Torrey Gillick, these were guys just coming into their peak years, coming in towards their early mid 20s. Suddenly they're coming back and they're 30 or 31, 32. And especially back then, generally by the time you were reaching 30, you were finished because you were playing on heavy pitches, heavy boots, tremendously heavy footballs, and without the sort of technology in terms of medical science as well to keep you going. So these players, you were generally considered finished. But nonetheless, when we did resume, we had a lot of the same players. They were sort of kept on. Maybe they had to, maybe there was some loyalty from the club, but probably 7 of that team were still at the club and playing when proper football resumed in 1946. But these were players who were either they'd missed 7 years of proper football. So even if they were still maybe physically able, they just hadn't had that level of competitiveness. To be your best and develop, you need to be playing, stretching yourself all the time. And they hadn't had that. And then you had other players who were what we would call over the hill because they were just now into their 30s and on the decline. We also lost Tommy Lawton, who was one of the greatest English forwards. It's a tragedy for him that he lost his best years to the war, but also he had relationship issues, domestic issues with his wife. So he decided to have a fresh start, and him and his wife wanted to move down to London. So he forced to move away from Everton to Chelsea just around the end of the wartime. So we lost Lawton, we lost Gillick, and another great little winger called Jimmy Caskey, 2 Scottish players. They went back to Glasgow and played for Rangers. And then Billy Cook and Jock Thompson, they retired from playing. So yeah, you'd lost probably 5 players who would have been regulars had football continued in 1939. Where everything went wrong is they didn't have the money to bring in suitable replacements. So we had very much a weakened team that set the path for the next 5 years, really, at Goodison Park.
The point of your book is that Everton could have started years of dominance in the league if not for the war. And that is due mainly to the average age of the side, which was like 24, as mentioned in your book by Tommy Lawton. Or is there more to it than that you can discuss?
I think there was huge potential in that team. One, they played a wonderful brand of football in 38, 39, and players like Lawton, Mercer, Gillick, Stevenson, Caskey, Jones, they were only going to get better. You hit your peak, around 26, 27. Generally, as a footballer, when you got that blend of experience and physical development, in theory, that Everton team would have probably peaked around 1942 if there hadn't been the war. So there's every chance. And I think that if you spoke to the players back then, I think there was every expectation they'd win more things. You can't say for sure they would have done because there were some other great teams there. Arsenal remained a wonderful team, a wonderful club. And in 1938-39, there were some great challenges like Wolves, Wolverhampton Wanderers were a great team. And even other clubs like Charlton, Middlesbrough, they were all up there. So you can't say for sure that Everton would have gone and won 3 league titles. But I think there's little doubt with the quality of those players that have won at least another title, maybe an FA Cup. It's hard to think that they wouldn't have won something, but you can never say, can you? It's one of those sliding doors moments. What we can speculate what might have been, but we can't know for sure. But I have little doubt it would have been for several years one of the greatest teams, Everton teams, to watch because he had such wonderfully gifted players.
Can you describe Everton's status and trajectory in the immediate after war years from 1946 into the decade of the 1950s?
When they kicked off in 1946, the Football League resumed in the late summer of 1946. As I say, a number of players were still in the team, but either through age or injury, they weren't the same players that they had been 7 years earlier. We didn't bring in the same quality of replacement. So Everton was struggling. We also still had that outdated model of Theo Kelly. Now, he was actually called secretary manager, but it was still the same structure. So, whereas other clubs were increasingly going to this more modern model of having a proper manager in charge of everything. So, Everton were getting left behind, frankly. Mid table finishes. And then as the years went on in the late 40s, it was more like finishes that were threatened with relegation. They did bring in a manager finally late in 1948, a former player called Cliff Britton, who had been a squad member back in 1938-39. and Britain tried its best to turn things around. But it was just on that one of these things where you just feel like you're on the slide, and eventually you're going to drop down. And sure enough, in 1951, the inevitable happened, and Everton fell through that trapdoor into the second division for only the second time in its history. And it took 3 more years to get back up to the first division. So these are some of the darkest times in Everton's history. And undoubtedly, if there hadn't been a war, they certainly wouldn't have been in that position where they were just on that sort of inexorable slide to relegation in the late 1940s, early 50s.
Did the departures of Lawton and Joe Mercer truly signal the demise of this team?
I think Lawton did. A generational talent, the natural heir to Dixie Dean. People say he was the complete centre forward, and he was still, at the end of the war, he was still probably only 25, 26. So, here was a player who was, in theory, coming into his peak years, and he left Everton. Maybe Everton should have tried harder to keep him. Joe Mercer, Everton thought he was finished and injured. He did have an injury, but Everton effectively thought he was no longer, fit for duty as a player at Everton and let him go to Arsenal. And Mercer then went and had probably about 7 or 8 wonderful years at Arsenal and proved Everton wrong. So a huge mistake to let Mercer go when they could have adjusted the way he played him more in a defensive role, so he didn't need to run as much, and they could have got huge value out of him. So those were huge losses, both in terms of ability, but also just what they brought to the team. I mean, Mercer was a fantastic personality, a great football man who became a great manager as well. Lawton was just, he called himself a big head. He called himself that. He was hugely confident as well as talented, and that enthusiasm and confidence would have rubbed off on teammates. So those were huge losses. But it was also generally the failure to replace a whole number of players who had left. Everton just didn't have the money or the imagination to bring in sort of players of anything like the same caliber after the war.
Getting back to the premise of your book, was that self-evident as well at the time, or only upon reflection?
I think the loss of Lawton, for example, people knew that was terrible because people realised he was what a special talent he was. I'm sure a lot of people thought Joe Mercer was finished. Certainly, you read the match reports, people weren't happy with the performances after the war. They could see that this was a team on the slide and that the directors were seemingly unable to act decisively to bring in the right replacements or bring in a proper manager early enough. So I think it was evident that this was a club on the slide. If you'd asked people in 1946, will Everton be relegated in a few years, that people wouldn't have seen that coming. I think that's only sometimes you need the benefit of hindsight to go back and look at it and see the warning signs. So looking back, you can see it was obvious. Maybe it wasn't obvious to clearly directors or supporters in 1945 or 46.
In closing, for Everton football historians, how is this Everton team ranked compared to other title winning sides of Everton?
As I said at the start, for my dad, this was the greatest collection of footballers, the greatest team Everton had. But obviously, there's recency bias. So there's no footage of that team, basically. So people will always, Everton supporters are always more likely to think of the team in the mid-1980s that won the league twice, or slightly older supporters will look to the team that won the league twice in the 1960s. And a lot of people say that team in 1969-70 was the greatest footballing side Everton had. My dad saw all of those teams, and he still rated the 39 team higher. And having gone back and read the reports, who am I to argue with the good judgment of my dad? So everybody will have their favourite team. My favourite team was the team in 1984-85. But having read about that team, I would dearly love to be able to travel back in time and watch Tommy Lawton, Joe Mercer, Ted Sagar, T.D. Jones, Torry Gillick, and their colleagues stride out onto Goodison Park and play football befitting of the club that was known back then as the School of Science.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the links to your books are listed on the blog and podcast uploads. And this is the book, chronicling this season. So, Rob, thank you once again, and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Thanks very much. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.